Ty, welcome to part 2. How you doing?
Hi, Dan. Why are you doing the intro?
I don't know. Why not? This is a 2-part show, 2-host show. I just figure I'm going to jump right in. We already did our teams, or the teams that we would prefer succeed, last week in Oregon, Notre Dame, with the addition of Georgia Tech. I said last week, last episode, Georgia Tech, UCF, and South Carolina.
Correct, yeah.
Today we've got 5 more. I feel particularly enthusiastic about these 5 teams. Caught a good workout outside last night, and I'm just feeling that juice, Ty. So I said, you know what? To the victors go the spoils, and I'm jumping in and trying to win this one.
Ole Miss, Utah, Wisconsin, Auburn, and Virginia Tech.
Great. Love it.
Are going to be our subjects today. Go back and listen to part 1 of this episode, which dropped on Tuesday. Actually, go back about a month or so and listen to all of the when will it happen for ...
Or will it
episodes.
ever happen for? Yeah.
Will it ever happen for? Whatever we called it. Over the last month, we did team-specific shows from USC to Penn State to Tennessee to Oklahoma State. A whole variety of teams got a great response. Welcome to all new listeners out there who have found us. In the interim, we're going to be doing 2 times a week, I guess, for the foreseeable future. As we get into July, we're obviously going to start previewing teams and getting you ready for the college football season in 2024, but we're not quite there yet, which is why we're doing this. So last episode, kind of on the heels of what we've been doing, we stepped into this conversation of, well, when will it happen? At what point will so-and-so, Notre Dame, Oregon, all the teams you just mentioned,
optimistically, yeah. This year, next year, few years, yeah.
Get to that quote-unquote next level, and we sort of define what that meant. On today's episode, we're doing the same thing, but with 5 more teams, none of which I would add are our quote-unquote preference.
Right.
Our favorite teams. We're going to talk, hopefully, a little bit more objectively about some of these
Yeah,
teams.
the way I'm looking at this is post-Halloween, when you're cleaning off your face paint or however you're dressed up, or you're figuring out who you woke up next to after that Halloween party. When you do open your phone and you're looking at whatever your app of choice and you're looking at the latest rankings, you're like, oh, look at that. My team is in the conversation. That's all. That's how I'm looking at this.
That's your definition.
Yeah.
My definition's a little bit more varied from team to team.
Okay.
So we'll go into that and much, much more here. Thank you for stopping on by. Hit follow, hit subscribe wherever it is you are listening or consuming this podcast. We appreciate it. That ensures you won't miss any of our episodes. We've got a lot planned here over the next 6 to 8 weeks or so as we start building to the 24 season. Of course, verballers.com is where you can go if you want to further support what Dan and I do. You can also get ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, access to Discord. You and I are right now in the lab trying to figure out exactly what the Patreon offering is going to be for this coming season. So a lot to come on that front. As always, we appreciate your support, or at least your consideration, by going out to verballers.com, Dan. The other thing that we did, instead of just mixing up, or I should say in addition to just mixing up the intro and having you do it, is you found a bunch of sounds, I think, that you feel optimistic about in addition to these teams, right?
Right. Well, we're tracking when this is going to happen for these teams. What is or isn't on the horizon.
Yeah.
I think that's A+ walkie-talkie gibberish.
Now, is that you on the walkie-talkie?
No.
Or is that
I just looked up walkie-talkie gibberish.
Okay, so we have no idea what that says.
No. And if it says anything problematic when you play it backwards or somehow unscramble it, apologies from Ty and myself.
Which of these 5 teams is most interesting to you?
So be Auburn, Ole Miss, Wisconsin, Virginia Tech, Utah.
Which one, as you look and survey the landscape?
I'll say the closest one, and that's Ole Miss.
Ole Miss. Okay. Ole Miss 11-2 season last year, beat Penn State in the Peach Bowl, finished top 10, ninth, I want to say, in the polls. For me, when we ask when will it happen, the it again is a little bit subjective here. For you, it's waking up next to whoever, whatever, after the Halloween party, looking at the polls and wondering, oh, okay, my team is there. For me, the it for Ole Miss is winning a playoff game. got to get in the playoff, got to win a playoff game. Because
never been to the playoff or BCS championship game. Yeah.
Never been. It feels to me like that is the thing that they are building towards. And they have been blocked because of the SEC and its divisional structure and the CFP and its structure, limiting it to only 4 teams. You know, over the last month, as we've done this, there have been a number of teams that we've called out and said, aha, Penn State, Tennessee, Kentucky, all these squads that now stand to benefit. Oklahoma State, another one.
Sure.
Teams that stand to benefit from the expanded playoff field, where it's not all on their regular season anymore. The pathway into meaningful postseason action is a lot wider. Ole Miss is a perfect example of a team that fits that bill. For what it's worth, if the playoffs had been expanded a year earlier, in the event of a 12-team playoff last year, Ole Miss would have gotten in as an 11 seed. They would have had to go on the road to play Georgia, which would not have been a great matchup. It wasn't the first time they played. But in round 1, getting to the playoff, Ole Miss would have been there last season. So it stands to reason with all they've got coming back, and we can get a little bit more specific here, that this would be the year that they would not only get in the playoff, but also achieve win a game. Maybe at home, maybe on the road. But
sure.
I think they're right there as we start building towards the season and looking out and projecting forward, like who are going to be our top 12. Ole Miss is certainly in that conversation, are they not?
Of course they are. And the intention is there, right? That Jackson Dart came back, which I'm positive means that whatever his NIL deal appears to be even sweeter than it was last year. You look at 20-plus guys brought in the portal via the Portal King, Lane Kiffin, highlighted by Walter Nolan, and a focus on defense, and I think rightfully so, as the offense has been lately ahead of the defense, which has been, at times, very good. Last year, it was the games against Alabama and Georgia, the Georgia one in particular, where Carson Beck looked like an NFL quarterback against this Ole Miss defense, spread the ball around. Georgia ran the ball super well. It was a complete thrashing. What Ole Miss has done is they're doing its best to address the defense. They went heavy on corner. They went heavy up front on defense. Again, Walter Nolan, the big one, but Juice Wells on the other side of the ball is one of the highlight names. They built up depth at running back after losing Quinshon Judkins. So there's a lot to love about where this Ole Miss roster should be going into the season, even with a pretty tough schedule. That last year it was the 2 teams that ended up in the SEC championship game that outclassed Ole Miss. I think Bama went on like a 21-3 run to finish out that game in the last 3 quarters, and Georgia just, especially in that second half, just stomped them. So it's weird to say, but Ole Miss isn't necessarily measuring itself against Georgia in this moment because they're simply trying to get in. And once they're there, then we'll see, because of how much easier it is now for a team like Ole Miss, who very clearly at their ceiling is one of the 12 best teams in the country. So they're fascinating to me. I don't know if it's win a playoff game this year or the year is a failure, but it's definitely a failure if this team does not make the playoff this year.
I would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Completely agree with that. 2 points that you mentioned that I also wanted to take and run with a little bit. So you mentioned the transfer class, the Portal King, Lane Kiffin. Ole Miss, per 24/7's transfer portal rankings, came in as the top transfer class.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really easy to get lost in those ratings and lose track of the strategy behind it. To your point, Ole Miss was very deliberate about how they use the portal. I think if you're not paying attention, you just see that they finish atop the list. You hear names, but to look at it like from a more zoomed out view, it's very clear that Lane Kiffin wanted to address defense with this portal class.
Sure.
And you mentioned Walter Nolan. There are obviously others. We don't have to list names, but there's like 6 guys that they brought in who might be starters. If not starters, they will contribute significantly to this defense. That was an Achilles heel. That was something they knew they needed to address. The other thing that they did that you didn't mention is they also tried to build some good depth along the offensive line. Towards the end of the season last year, they were crazy beat up along the line. So they went out, they got 2 guards from Washington. They got Diego Pounds. They brought him down from UNC. Maybe would start at one of the tackle spots. It's one of those deals where I think very strategically, they're looking at this and they're saying, well, we needed help up front. We did not have the depth up front. And now that the season is presumably going to be a little bit longer if we make the playoff, we need to make sure we have enough depth there. And they went out, they addressed it. So I give him a lot of credit for doing that. Bill C ran the numbers just based on what they've got on this roster now. 70% returning production, which is number 22 nationally. I can talk about that in a little bit and maybe put that returning production number in context because we throw it around a lot here, but understanding what it means, I think, is important for the people that listen to this show. This is all a very long way of saying that. I think the Ole Miss roster is in a really good spot, and Lane Kiffin did a lot to address depth and also some of the key areas where they need to get better. The second thing where I'd push back a little bit, not too much, because you're right. You play an SEC schedule, obviously it's going to be difficult. But Ole Miss is not exactly like a South Carolina. It is not exactly like I'll just use a different example, Georgia Tech, where we look at the schedule and we say, man, that is a murderer's row.
They're the one who knock. Yeah.
I think as far as the SEC scheduling draw went, Ole Miss got it pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, it's always going to be tough. It's in the SEC. That's just what the SEC is. But their toughest opponents are Georgia and Oklahoma, both of which are at home.
LSU is in there, yeah.
LSU is away. Florida is away, but who knows what Florida is going to look like by that point in the season. They could be without Billy Napier for all we know. They've got a Kentucky game also at home. The Egg Bowl is also at home. Last I saw, their over-under is about 9.5, which I think is a good tell for how Vegas feels about the schedule. Obviously, this team is loaded, but I think the schedule, just with the way this thing shakes out, like, I don't think they're going to beat Georgia, but I like that that game's at home. I think they've got a really good chance of beating Oklahoma. I like the fact that that game's at home. I think in terms of home road splits, there are some tough road games. You're just going to have that. But by and large, this is not a schedule I look at and I'm like, man, there are no breaks in this thing. I think it actually shakes out pretty well for them.
The other thing I am sort of bullish on with Ole Miss, and it's a small sample size theater situation, but last year's games against LSU and A&M, defensive clunkers, who won? Ole Miss, right?
Ole Miss.
That I think it's fair for Ole Miss people to have increased faith in Lane Kiffin in weird games late, that it's back and forth 5 times in the fourth quarter or something, and that he is going to figure out a way to time things up, to have a plan at the end of a game, to have a certain set of Excelsior plays. That's what I call like the, break glass when needed type offensive sets where they're confident in what they're going to run at the end of a game, even if they're not constantly getting stops, that the offense will be in a good place, that they can manage the clock, that the coaching staff has now been there. Your guy, Charlie Weiss's son, has been there forever now as Lane's offensive coordinator. By forever, I mean like a couple of years. But there is a certain amount of stability within Ole Miss as well. They've hired big name analysts. It's Pete Golding and Charlie Weiss Jr. and Byron Brown as the coordinators. Like they're in a great place that it becomes more and more surprising if they were to lose something dumb in a dumb way to a dumb team. All due respect to all teams.
The floor has been raised significantly over the last couple of years. And I was kind of like, Ole Miss was obviously a really good team to use as part of this conversation because they're on the cusp. It feels like they're knocking on the door, especially now with the expanded playoff and with the new divisionless structure and just how college football has changed. Ole Miss is in a really good spot to reap the benefits of that. I did, for a second, hesitate about putting them in the show because I feel like we know exactly what Ole Miss is. There's not a whole lot of mystery here. We're going to talk about some other teams that I think are a little bit more mysterious and can't quite put your finger on what that team is going to be. We know exactly what Ole Miss is. Ole Miss didn't play much defense. They were okay.
They're fine.
Last season. They were okay last season. But if we're looking at this in terms of what is the Achilles heel, by and large, you'd say defense. They addressed that in the portal. Offense is not really an issue. Maybe against some of the better teams they played. That's a separate conversation. But this team right now, easily good enough to make the CFP and probably win a game. It's again going to be a lot of matchup dependency that we're going to need to consider if and when that comes to fruition. But by and large, like this team's really damn good. They should be in the playoff, and if they're not, I agree. It's a disappointment.
By the way, wrinkle with what you brought up with Oregon, like what happens if Dylan Gabriel gets hurt? What happens if Jackson Dart gets hurt? Walker Howard, one of the nation's like 5 best backup quarterbacks, probably, along with probably Dante Moore and Arch Manning and
Steve Angeli, throw him in.
I'm a Kenny Minchie guy myself, but sure,
Okay.
absolutely. With whatever is the quarterback room and what it's going to look like at Ohio State, perhaps. There's some interesting rooms out there, and Ole Miss having that option and just long term, Lane Kiffin is going to find portal quarterbacks to run his offense very successfully as long as he is in Oxford. So a nice depth wrinkle there.
And unless I'm mistaken, I believe Walker Howard was part of that infamous 360 dance video with Brian Kelly at LSU.
Was he? Oh,
I think he
Good
was
to
the
know.
dude. Correct me if I'm wrong.
all right.
At me if I'm wrong. Okay. So I think we have come to a consensus on Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Let's get into some other teams that I think are a bit more ambiguous. Let's talk about the Wisconsin Badgers.
The Badgers, Bucky Badgers.
Badgers.
Yeah, Badgers.
7-6 last year, Luke Fickell's first season. Played LSU, lost to LSU in the bowl game. What is a reasonable quote-unquote it for Wisconsin? So if I am forcing you to drill down a little bit more, not just in the conversation come November 1st, but if I were to say the it for Wisconsin is making the playoff,
Mm-hmm.
how far out are we from that? Do you think that is a reasonable burden to put on Luke Fickell or to put on Wisconsin at this point? Or am I getting too far out in front of myself?
Correct me if I'm wrong. Luke Fickell, 4-team playoff coach, yes?
Correct.
And now we're asking him with more talent and more resources available to him in Madison to make a 12 and eventual 14-team playoff.
Correct. That's what I'm
At
saying.
a team that has had national success, has played in Rose Bowls, etc., has beaten big teams out of conference, has beaten big teams in conference.
It does not feel to me like that is unreasonable.
Not unreasonable.
Just doing a sense check here. I want to get your sense
Now,
on this.
Check out the 2017 Wisconsin schedule. Check out the 2024 Wisconsin schedule.
A little different.
Check out, and I know Wisconsin had a good defense last year, but check out the offenses that they faced last year in their final year of that true Big Ten West experience.
A lot of the green yuck emoji.
Absolute
With those opposing offenses.
trash. I don't know what the opposite of a murderer's row, like a slapper's row of offense is last year.
It's a pillow fight.
There's work to be done on this Wisconsin team. They went heavy, I think, after linebacker in the portal this year. I imagine that this Wisconsin defense is going to continue to improve. I imagine Luke Fickell, and it's what Mike Tressel, their defensive coordinator, are going to continue to find 3-star defensive talent in the Midwest, although they're recruiting, I think, more nationally than Paul Chryst did. I mean, you kind of had to. And they're going to develop NFL caliber defensive players like Wisconsin has this storied tradition of doing that aren't coming in as blue chips. They will do that at Wisconsin. To me, the question is, are they winning close games against good teams? Are they winning games against great teams over the course of the season? Do we consider them one of those very strong Big Ten teams in a Big Ten that adds Oregon and Washington, USC, UCLA, and already has Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan at or near the top? Penn State has who this year in the non-conference? Alabama, week 2? Or excuse me, Wisconsin has Alabama
Wisconsin's
week 2?
got Alabama week 2, yeah.
With Penn State, Oregon, who else on the schedule?
So this year, Wisconsin, as I pull it up here, they've got Alabama. They've got a road game against USC. They're home against Penn State. They're home against Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
They're on the road against Iowa. By the way, if you're a Wisconsin season ticket holder, the slate of home games, that you get to see, Alabama, Penn State, Oregon, among others, that's pretty damn good.
What a
That's
year.
about as good as you're ever going to get as a season ticket holder. I don't know how many of those games are going to win. They could go 0-3. But at least to see those games in person will be pretty damn cool.
And do they not on the road this year? They have like a really weird middle stretch on their schedule because it includes a Piscataway trip and a trip to Lake Michigan to play Northwestern. Like literally on the lake, Wisconsin football will be playing.
There is a stretch, a 6-week stretch starting the last week of September that goes at USC, back home against Purdue, at Rutgers, back in the Midwest, Lake Michigan against Northwestern, back home against Penn State, then on the road against Iowa. That stretch of games ultimately will define which direction this season goes,
Right.
because there are games in there that they should win, frankly. But I think the bookends, right, where you've got Alabama in the first 3 weeks, Oregon in the last 3 weeks, those games will be interesting, like fodder for conversation. But ultimately, if Wisconsin's going to have a better season, it's going to happen in that 6-week period in the middle.
Yeah. When will it happen for Wisconsin? My answer is weirdly last year, right? Given that schedule. So when will it happen for this iteration and this growing program? I don't have them as a playoff contending in earnest team into November until probably 2026. I think it's going to take that long. That it was either 5 or 6 years in at Cincinnati for Luke Fickell to get all of those not super seniors, but seniors and upperclassmen, the lockdown corners, the pass rushers, everything like that. Des Ritter as an experienced quarterback, Jerome Ford, like it all came together that many years in. And I think it'll happen quicker at Wisconsin because it's a bigger destination, but the challenge is also more robust in the Big Ten. So I have it as 2026 as that's what I would circle. I'm not a huge TVD believer, though I am a Phil Longo believer. And there's still just the pop at receiver is just not doing it for me. This is a year-over-year thing for me. When they're able to find that, which they were able to do at times at Cincinnati, but that was also an issue there. I think he's going to recruit really well, all things considered, for Wisconsin relative to their recruiting history. Like, I think we'll see some top 20, 25-ish classes continue, but I think more depth is needed in that conference. So I have it 2026.
Yeah, I mean, we both share a lot of faith in Luke Fickell to build this program back up with a more modern offense. And last year kind of went off the rails when Tanner Mordecai broke his hand in like week 7, whenever that was. This year it's going to be TVD's offense, presumably. I agree with you on the playmaking side of things. I think it's going to take a while to build that back up. So I don't think they're ready quite yet. I jotted down 2 to 3 years away from Fickell, establishing that base, getting the program to good, stable footing.
Yeah.
Which, to be fair, it's not stable now. I just think it needs a little bit more Luke Fickell seasoning before it's ripe to the point where we can talk about this in earnest. And I think Wisconsin 2 to 3 years out for being in that conversation. It won't be with TVD. It may not be with the next guy, but I think it's going to be a slow build at Wisconsin. If you're a Wisconsin fan, a slow build is a really good thing to have. If you've got a coach that you've got faith in who can do the slow build and get the program very gradually to a point where it's constantly in this conversation, that's what you want. You always want to contend right away.
Yeah.
You always want to have those seasons, but you don't want to be a flash in the pan. And I don't think Wisconsin will be under Luke Fickell.
I think if they had this last year's schedule with this year's roster and experience, again, if I had wheels, I'd be a bicycle. It'd be a 10-2 program.
No.
I don't think they lose to Northwestern in the manner that they did, just getting gashed on the ground. They don't lose to Indiana. But you're also, having a starting quarterback who's healthy all year, which is never a guarantee with TVD. So, 2026. I'll stick by that, and I think they become more interesting and dangerous along the way.
When will Virginia Tech get back to 9 or 10 wins a year?
They're not recruiting right now like they're building that roster to do so. And that's what gives me concern.
So let me start this conversation a different way.
Okay.
Virginia Tech, storied program. Frank Beamer was there forever.
Yeah.
Can you tell me the last time Virginia Tech finished a season with only 3 losses? And that includes a regular season plus the bowl game.
Was it the Gerard Evans year? Year 1 or whatever of
I don't know if
Fuente?
it was Gerard Evans year, but it was 2011.
Oh, okay. So maybe they lost more. That was like 2015 or 16. Yeah.
Yeah, you got to go back to Frank Beamer.
Okay.
To find that. A lot of folks are high on Virginia Tech this year, and I think rightfully so. I mentioned returning production earlier. Virginia Tech is 4th nationally in Bill Connolly's updated rankings, 84% returning production, which is a really high number. Only Iowa State, Stanford, and Oklahoma State are in front of them right now. Let me demystify returning production. I mentioned it earlier. Okay. Because we talk a lot about it. Sometimes I think I lean a little bit too heavily on it. I'm guilty of that. Generally, with this statistic, the extreme examples are the ones that are the most predictive. So, good example that Bill used in his Twitter thread was that last year's top 4 in returning production were Kansas, Mizzou, Florida State, and Michigan. If you take those teams combined versus the previous season, combined, those 4 teams won 13 more games last season.
Yeah.
So clearly it played some factor. Last year's bottom 4, Kent State, UAB, ECU, and Stanford, combined to lose combined to win 13 fewer games, let's say. So a little bit of symmetry there, but you get the point. I think what we could take away from that number is that Virginia Tech's going to get better. You combine that returning production with the schedule, which we've been talking about since February. I feel like other people have been late to the bandwagon here.
Sure.
We've been talking about this schedule forever. It is beautiful. It's easy to understand why the preseason hype is there. At Miami, week 5, home against Clemson, week 11. Otherwise, a lot of Stanford and Boston College and Georgia Tech and Syracuse and Duke. And there's a reason their over-under is, I think it started at 7.5 and has since bumped up to 8 at DraftKings. You get it.
Mm-hmm.
We're also really high on Kyron drones.
Sure.
I don't know if I like drone heads more or dronies. Do you have a preference for the nomenclature? Can you do better than either of those?
Oh, first of all, I'm rejecting your proposed raging droner, excuse me.
Raging the droner?
Yeah.
Okay.
Drone heads is not bad. It's pretty, straightforward. Rhymes with cone heads.
We can work with that. We're both high on Kyron drones.
Yes.
What we can't do, though, is pretend that Virginia Tech's offense was like a well-oiled machine last year. Because against the better teams on their schedule, they were not good. Tech gained 140 yards and lost by 31 to Louisville. The Florida State game, they gave up 22 in the first quarter. They came back. They made it a one-score game, but they ultimately lost that one handily. Kyron drones showed flashes. The offense showed flashes. I like where it seems as if that is headed, but it is still a very much unfinished product. And in going through and doing the research here, I'm not necessarily hedging on my Virginia Tech optimism, but you go back and you look and it's like, I understand why people are optimistic. I get the hype. I'm not sure I want to jump in with both feet in looking back at what we saw last year. They've gotten better for sure. And I get why it's 8 wins. If the conversation for me is getting back to 9 or 10 wins, there's a case to be made that could happen as soon as this year. But I did find cause for pause, favorite pet charity, and looking back at what happened last year for the Hokies.
Look, so you can look at it 2 different ways. You can say this is a team that went, 3-8 the year before, and they turned it around and made a bowl team, became a bowl team, and had a god-awful September, losing to shady law firm Purdue, Rutgers, and Marshall. And Kyron drones found his footing, and they were able to beat up on clearly flawed ACC teams and at times compete with decent ACC teams, at times not really compete with ACC teams. And are they fake good or are they impressive growing? And so that's where you have to come down on one side at some point with Virginia Tech.
I think they are growing. I also think there is some fake good. I think they are in that gray area because when Brent Pry got there, you'll remember the conversation we had about, wow, there's a lot of guys changing positions.
Mm-hmm.
They just did not have quality depth anywhere. Their offense was a disaster. Their offense improved. A lot improved last season. And so, again, I understand the hype. It looks like if you are drawing a trend line, they are going up and to the right. They're doing it right.
Sure.
But also, there are plenty of signals from last season, if you look into some of the numbers, where it was not consistent throughout. It wasn't like consistently you saw throughout the course of like the back half of the season, market improvement that, oh boy, when they hit the ground running in 2024, this thing is going to be like a rocket ship. I do not get that impression.
Yeah, they also, like Wisconsin, they played one of the worst collections of offenses in America on last year's schedule, and I think those offenses will improve. And so my question with Virginia Tech at this point, we know there's pop with Kyron Drones, that he's a dual threat, that he's a playmaker. We know the defensive line got after quarterbacks last year impressively. At this moment, I just don't see them as built to impress in November against quality teams and to be in that conversation anytime soon. Doesn't mean they're not, a decent team. Here's what I'm paying attention to with Virginia Tech. One, what is the direction of recruiting and interesting upgrades in the portal these next couple seasons? And also, does the ACC become a sort of Big 12 where it becomes more wide open and it's anybody's guess within the top tier of 4 or 5 teams if and when some combination of Florida State, Clemson, Miami, whoever, North Carolina, find new homes in the next few years? Then Virginia Tech becomes exponentially more interesting, but we're talking about multiple factors, difficult factors needing to happen. So when will it happen for Virginia Tech? To me is still going to remain November conversation. I guess we can. I don't know what their schedule looks like next year. It's not going to be this year. I think the roster's too far away. But Kyron Drones, if he comes back, he has another year after this, eligibility wise, I believe. So you're talking about him as like a 5th-year guy. Sure, I think next year, depending on what happens in the portal, depending on what happens with the growth of players this year, it's possible. But I'm going to say it's sort of NA at the moment because of the roster quality and just going to need to see results against more decent teams.
Yeah. Now, I will add one qualifier to what I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And while I don't feel like it was obvious the last, say, 6 weeks of the season that this team was just steadily improving. On offense, more often than not, and they played some bad teams down the stretch, but on offense, they overperformed projections.
Sure. They did what a good team should do offensively against those opponents. Yeah.
And that was due in no small part to what Kyron Drones was able to show us. Part of why we're excited about him. Defensively on the whole, they kind of took a minor step back last year. It was mostly the same as the year prior. But that, to me, is what felt like it was a little bit more tougher to put your finger on, right? Like
Agreed.
A game against NC State later in the year, what happened with that defensive showing? They gave up 35 points to NC State. Okay, that's interesting. With that offense at that point in time, that was surprising to me. So I just feel like I'd like a little bit more consistency before I go to bat for Virginia Tech as like a 10-win team in 2024.
Yeah.
I don't see that happening. But I think 8 wins feels like very doable with the schedule. If they're halfway competent, they should get to 8. If they're more than halfway competent, they should get to 9. So I think it could happen as soon as this year.
Schedule is, to be fair, you're right. Schedule's pretty great if the growth remains linear.
If it remains linear.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
They have at Miami and at Stanford back to back. So they're going corner of the country, full other coast in consecutive weeks. I think the Miami game's a Friday night game. You forgot one other very important factor with Virginia Tech, Ty. We discovered on our Message Board Geniuses show that a Virginia Tech fan was immediately impressed with Brent Pry's first, time as Virginia Tech's head coach because it appeared that he had a massive hog, right?
That's right.
That's what that Message Board Genius unearthing discovered, that there was some message board poster. So now we're talking about what can Brent Pry look like following through on that vision in close games. Year 3 now for Brent Pry. And, they're down 2019, 4th and 7. Does this Virginia, are they making those big hog decisions?
Right.
So it's Brent Pry's, essentially, his hog above replacement in the ACC. Factor it in, Ty.
Would that be a HORP? What is that considered?
I think is it hog above replacement?
Har. Oh, I'm thinking VORP. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess VOR would be value over replacement player.
Yeah.
So that would be H.
Value over replacement hog.
H VOR with a silent H at the end.
Like hors d'oeuvres, but reverse.
Yeah.
Okay. Utah.
Yes.
8-5 last year, lost to Northwestern in the bowl game. The it for Utah is getting to and winning a playoff game. And I don't think that's
winning a playoff game?
Winning a playoff game.
I don't know. I think you got to get there before you win. You got to walk before you run, right?
All right. Put a pin in that for a second.
All right.
We need to start with a different question then if we're going to talk about Utah and be on the same page.
Okay.
Is Utah already the best team in the Big 12? They just got there. Are they the best team in the Big 12?
I'm going to say no.
Because if they're, even if they're not the best, if they're one of the, say, 2 best, getting into the playoffs should not be much of an issue. And winning a playoff game with the style that they play, it'll be very matchup dependent. Not everybody can go toe-to-toe and play Utah's brand of football and win.
Right.
But I don't think getting to the playoff is all that big of an obstacle for this team, especially now in this new conference.
Okay. Non-conference slate, nothing. Utah State, Southern Utah, Baylor. And the Baylor game is in Salt Lake City. Not especially worried, though that was a reasonably close game last year with Utah's backup quarterback. So at Oklahoma State, Arizona, back-to-back. That's going to be tough.
They play 2 teams that are projected to be ranked in the top 25, and both are in back-to-back weeks in September. At Oklahoma State, home against Arizona. The rest of the way, though, I looked at it and I said the rest of the way, if Cam Rising's healthy, Utah could win all those games. They could go unbeaten against this schedule. I don't think it's bad at all.
So I hear you. I think the Big 12, and I think Utah's schedule in particular, is stock full of teams that if I told you one of them went 5-7 or 9-3, you'd be like, yeah, I could see that. That's
the story of the Big 12 this year, though.
It's the story of the Big 12. So I don't know how to gauge Utah's schedule, honestly, because when you lose a playoff team in Texas, when you lose a perennial champion in Oklahoma, you lose tiers and you lose the ability to gauge where everybody is falling in. And so, if you tell me Iowa State's 9-3, you tell me they're 5-7. Sure. Same thing about TCU or Arizona. You tell me ASU is as feisty as they looked at times last year as they move forward. Sure. Like, I'm willing to believe so much about so many of these teams without obvious losses. Like it seemed like a lot of them would have against recent Texas or recent Oklahoma. So Utah's place in this, they have the most experienced quarterback. As far as I can tell.
25-year-old Cam Rising.
They should have good lines. They lose key guys in the secondary. They've largely recruited pretty well, though it seems like they've taken a slight step back, though I think they do have a quarterback of the future local to Utah. So that's good. I think they're in a very good position to compete for the Big 12. Of course I do. But without the year-over-year experience of playing all of these teams, and I mentioned Baylor as a non-conference opponent, which they are not, but I think is it the back end of a home and home because they played them last year? I think, correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
Yeah. So what I am curious about with Utah is immediate comfort in a new conference, going to new stadiums by and large, and this is the same question I'm always going to have about Utah under Kyle Whittingham is like, can they find pop at receiver? Can they go downfield and succeed? They lose a big weapon in tight end at tight end. I'm there with Utah in that top tier, but there's still a decent amount of firepower at a lot of these teams' best, the Kansas schools. So yes, top tier, will compete for the conference this year, not waltzing in as obvious best team.
I mean, but they don't play any of the Kansas schools.
Yeah, that's
true. They don't play Kansas. They don't play Kansas State. They do have a game.
I mean, they could end up playing them in the conference championship.
They could end up playing them in a championship. They have a game late in the year. It's at home, late in the year against Iowa State, which I think is interesting because Iowa State's another one of those teams. I mentioned them earlier. But
close in the bounce house against your UCF Knights.
Close in the bounce house. Iowa State's got a lot coming back. They're one of those other teams on the extreme side of having a lot of returning production. There is the Holy War. Now they're in the same conference against BYU. That one also in November.
Colorado, Folsom, yeah.
There are games on here that are interesting that I know we will talk a lot about when they come to fruition, but just early June projections, as I see it, this looks very manageable, especially if Utah's got a healthy Cam Rising.
But how much?
I don't know if we can assume that, though, right? Because we thought he'd be healthy and ready to go last season.
Yeah.
And he wasn't. He was hurt way more than anybody knew, needed a lot more surgical repairs than anybody knew.
Could play next year, too, my man.
Could play next year, which I can't even fathom that.
Yeah.
But, you know, the proof is in the pudding from a stats standpoint when you've got a healthy Cam Rising. Cam Rising played 24 games, I want to say, between 2021 and 2022. In that span of time, Utah's offense in the SP Plus now went up to 14th and 11 nationally in those 2 years. Last year with Bryson Barnes, with Nate Johnson, that odd collection of characters that they put forth, 65th nationally. It was apparent that they needed more pop at quarterback, that they needed more pop just from a playmaking standpoint. The line wasn't as good. They had trouble running the ball, at least as compared to previous seasons. So it was not maybe Utah's best collection out there on display, especially given the injury. But if he's healthy, there's a reason the over-under this year is 9.5.
The question, though, with Utah to me, though, and this is sort of isolated to Utah, is they were so beat up everywhere last year on both sides of the ball that when year over year rosters are changing so much, 2022, 2021, they go to the Rose Bowl both seasons. It's what, Ohio State, Penn State. And then 2019, so, you know, you weigh COVID however you want to weigh it in terms of that season. But like 2019, I think they finished top 15-ish. So what we're doing right now in our Utah optimism is saying, well, Kyle Whittingham always figures it out. Morgan Scaley always figures it out. But we're not actually talking about what's on the roster or what they've done lately, because what they did lately was play a bunch of third-string dudes and walk-ons last year and switching guys different positions everywhere. Like they moved their safety to a starting wildcat quarterback / running back / slot receiver in Sione Vaki. And he's gone, by the way. So we're just sort of talking about Utah in this vague, like a Kyle Whittingham team should be the favorite, which he's proven himself to be a championship type coach. But we really don't have a concept for where Utah is right now, other than Cam Rising should be healthy.
That's all true.
That's all we have kind of to go on at the moment.
They still went 8-4 last year.
Right.
They still went 8-4 despite all of that. And I agree. I mean, you're moving Sione Vaki around and putting walk-ons in there, third stringers in there. They were super beat up. It wasn't just Cam Rising. But to win 8 games, they lost the bowl game, whatever. To win 8 games to get there at all, I think is a testament to what Kyle Whittingham does. It wasn't always sexy. It's never sexy.
Yeah, if you watched the UCLA game last year, definitely not sexy. If you watched the Northwestern game, definitely not sexy.
No, not sexy.
But yeah, it was a weird year. You know, Bryson Barnes beats USC on the road. Sione Vaki has the game against Cal. ASU super flawed, and they just blow them out of the water. They have a shot against Washington, not competitive against Arizona, take down Colorado. Like, I think he will this team, Kyle Whittingham and Cam Rising, to 8 wins. But as a playoff conversation, I just don't know if they're there. I'm not there yet with them.
I think they will have an opportunity this year to win a playoff game. And I think it is very matchup dependent.
Okay.
Very matchup dependent. I think they are good enough. They're well coached enough for sure to get to that spot to win a game. I think it's very matchup dependent, though.
If you had to wager $1,000 of your American currency, brag much, Ty has $1,000 at his disposal.
Yeah, sure.
Would you take Utah to win the Big 12 over, not the field, but because that's just bad value, but like if you were to place your grand on any team in the Big 12?
So here's what I would do.
Yeah.
I am not venturing into the snake pit that is the Big 12 title odds.
I'm sure.
The Big 12 feels like a complete crapshoot. We've said it once. We've said it many times since all of this broke and conference realignment happened. This year, the Big 12 is the most interesting conference because it's totally wide open. Mm-hmm. No idea who's going to emerge. If I were betting $1,000 on anything around Utah, I would bet over 9.5.
Wow.
That feels like a very safe bet to me.
I like that they don't have the Kansas schools. I do like that.
Yeah. I would go over 9.5 because I don't see that many losses on the schedule.
Okay.
Provided Cam Rising's healthy.
Yeah.
That's the big X factor. As it was last year, same is true this year.
I think if everybody is somewhere near their ceiling, all things being reasonably equal, I think Utah has the best chance to pair quarterback and defense together than any other team in this conference. Kansas has a quarterback. Kansas State probably has a quarterback. UCF has a quarterback. I just think Utah has that defensive edge, the beef edge.
The beef edge.
Yeah.
Perfect. Let's close things out with the Auburn Tigers.
Oh, spicy. I like this.
Auburn 6-7 last year. They lost the Music City Bowl to Maryland 31-13. As I've got it here on my sheet for Auburn, is getting back to 9 or 10 wins.
Okay.
I think in terms of your rubric, in terms of what you're using as your measuring stick, if Auburn in the SEC gets to 9 or 10 wins, they are by default in that November conversation, are they not?
Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Right?
Yes.
Auburn has finished with 7 losses the last 3 years after the season, accounting for the bowl games, whatever.
Yes.
That includes the entirety of the Brian Harsin / Cadillac Williams era, as well as Hugh Freeze's first year in 2023. Auburn, I think, is a really, really interesting topic for discussion because they are very tactical, at least by my account, in terms of how they're using both high school and portal recruiting. They finished top 10 in high school recruiting, number 28 in transfer portal recruiting. There was a very clear focus in the portal that was receiver and that was depth, especially on defense. The high school class also went very hard at receiver. I am in love with Cam Coleman, their 5-star freshman. I think he's going to be a monster in the college ranks. They also added some edge guys. So they are trying to add impact positions.
They added, it was Robert Lewis, the Georgia State transfer receiver? Yeah.
Yep. And Amaris Williams is the 5-star edge guy that they got in high school.
Yeah. Bobby Lou. Continue.
Yeah. You can see that there is a deliberate effort underway by Hugh Freeze to try and plug some of those gaps and make this team better. In terms of getting back to 9 or 10 wins, I don't see it happening with Peyton Thorne at quarterback.
Same.
Against an SEC schedule, he's just too mistake prone. He's gritty. He can move. He's not good enough as a passer to get them to 9 or 10 wins. So with that as kind of the basis for this, at least from my standpoint, I think we're 2 to 3 years out. And I don't know if it's Walker White, their true freshman quarterback that they just brought in, who's everybody is very excited about. Not to be confused with Walter White, which is what I did when I first read it.
Nice.
Different thing altogether. Yep. But Walker White drew comparisons to Will Levis, like a bulkier dual threat guy coming out of high school. Don't know where the stance is on the mayo and the coffee or eating bananas weirdly, but
right.
I think if it's going to happen for Auburn, it's gonna need to be after the Thorne era ends. He is just kind of like a holdover until they get better at that position.
Or maybe it's just another Midwestern quarterback transferring down south and being immediately better, like Danny Etling, like Graham Ertz, like Joe Burrow, like any of these guys. And Peyton Thorne is just waiting for some more stability, which Auburn should have this year up front at receiver. And this is, what'd you say? They went hard after defensive linemen, I want to say.
They did a lot of work
up front on
receiver,
defense. Yeah.
At receiver, both in the portal and through high school recruiting.
Yeah.
And the same is true in the transfer portal. They added a lot on defense, but they're really pretty focused on that edge rusher.
Right. It's a pretty tricky meaty middle after a soft early season. It's Kentucky. Excuse me, I'm looking at Ole Miss's schedule. I'm going to pull up Auburn's schedule now because that's the kind of pro I am. Come on, Ty. Come on. I used to be a professional, and now look at me. I'm a shell of myself. Okay, I wrote down meaty middle. Arkansas at home. Oklahoma at home. At Georgia, bye week. At Mizzou, at Kentucky. And they finish with A&M and the Iron Bowl on the road.
I would say that's a meaty middle.
Yeah.
You've got Oklahoma and Georgia on back-to-back weeks, then a bye and 2 road games at Mizzou and at Kentucky.
Yes.
That 4-week stretch is going to determine a lot for Auburn this season.
Agree. Here's the actual good news for Auburn right now is in year 1, they came up with a terrific game plan for Georgia and threw a ton at the Bulldogs in a very competitive game without having a competitive roster. They were a freak play away from winning the Iron Bowl against the eventual SEC champion with a not terribly competitive roster. So now the question is, when you add a full portal class, when you have impact freshmen that, I don't know if Cam Coleman's immediately going to compete for the Blitnikoff, but he's going to come in and be a playmaker, we think. I don't think the passing game is going to be crazy, but long term, I think we both believe Hugh Freeze is going to string together top 10, 12, 15 classes at Auburn, if not better.
Yeah,
it already looks like the 2025 class is on its way to being pretty impressive. They have a quarterback of the future. And say what you will about the likability of their head coach. Losing Nick Saban, having Texas A&M start over, having Mississippi State start over, having Florida flounder, Georgia's going to be a monster forever. But the stability in the SEC isn't great among those traditional teams, but adding Texas, Oklahoma becomes more difficult. I think Auburn's pretty well positioned. I'm going to say next year they're in that conversation. Not this year, despite my Midwestern quarterback, protestations, whatever. Is that a word? I'm going to say next year, post Peyton Thorne, I think they become increasingly dangerous with a roster that still needs a little bit more work.
The other thing that I would add on the Peyton Thorne side.
Yeah.
There is an assumption that he'll be the starter. I think that's the safest assumption.
Yeah.
Hugh Freeze has not said anything negative about Peyton Thorne. He also hasn't been glowing about Peyton Thorne when they've asked him about the quarterback competition. He's basically saying that Peyton Thorne's the guy. He's had the most reps. He's the most consistent, I think are his exact words, been the most consistent. But he's not saying it's a slam.
He really has a big handle on this offense. I think we're going to see a big jump. Yeah.
Those types of things. So people who cover Auburn a little bit more intently have at least left that door open for maybe somebody else. Maybe somebody else could sneak in, could get reps, could get some claim to the throne. We'll see. I think it's going to be Peyton Thorne. But by and large, the more you read about Auburn, seems to be a consensus that Walker White is the guy who's got the highest ceiling among everybody in that quarterback room. It's just he's a true freshman. He may not be ready for that job. Yeah, it's a lot.
And say what you will about Auburn, Ty. At halftime last year, they were right there with New Mexico State. They were right there with the Aggies of Jerry Kill and New Mexico State. So
very true.
They were, building. That's all. I'm a jackass.
Solidverbal@gmail.com is our email address. Please write in. Let us know your thoughts. Next week, we are going to do a super mega 2-part mailbag episode.
Love that.
So please send in your questions to our email, to any of our platforms. We would love to incorporate as many, if not all, of your questions as humanly possible. But we get a lot of them. So send them in. We'll do our best. We'll address the ones that we think make for the best conversation. Also, if you have any other teams that you'd like for us to talk about here in the preseason, I guess that's what we're at now. Let us know, solidverbal@gmail.com, any of our social platforms. Hit follow, hit subscribe. Of course, if you've listened the full way through to this show, we would love to have you on board with us here for all of our episodes, really. We're going to be doing a lot more of them and then upping the frequency as we get into July to talk more about the preseason.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think that does it for When Will It Happen week here on the show. We've got a lot more planned, as we've said time and again. Make sure you hit follow, hit subscribe one more time so you don't miss any of the episodes. Dan Rubenstein, enjoy your weekend away.
Thank you very much. A little early June family vacation. I'm excited, Ty.
Do it. Got to get it in while you can.
Yeah.
For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildebrand, thank you for downloading, for listening, for supporting the show. We will talk to you all next week. Meantime, stay solid.
Peace.